Happy New Year. It's the first day back at Westminster for MPs. And joining me on the show today to talk about her story and some of the issues of the day is Kezia Dugdale, former leader of Labour in Scotland. Welcome to People in Politics. Kezia Dugdale, thank you so much for doing this. It's nice to see you again.
Likewise, I'm thrilled to be here, David, and it's great to hear the podcast is going from strength to strength.
I'm so enjoying doing it. I just started this last October, and people like yourself, you're really generous with your time, and I'm having some great conversations, and you never know where it's gonna go on. So yeah, I'm gonna stick at it.
Good.
That's good. So I made a wee plan for today, and I thought, if you don't mind, we'll talk a wee bit about your past and your early life, how you came into politics, and then of course your time as party as parliamentarian and party leader, and then of course the John Smith Institute. That's okay. So, you were born in Aberdeen but grew up in Fife, and you went to the Harris Academy. Did you have a good experience at school?
Do you know, I had a brilliant time at school, David, and I would wish that for every kid in Scotland. You're right, I was born in Aberdeen, but that's mostly because there wasn't a maternity hospital in Elgin, which was the town that I went to primary school in the northeast of Scotland. And I used to think that was the best place in the world for a kid to grow up because it's very safe, lovely, great big parks. My primary school had a huge playground and lots of grass fields, and I played hockey at lunchtime and football and took on the boys at every opportunity, which would come
Yeah.
to be a bit of a life lesson. But then at the end of primary school, my mum's job changed. She got promoted, and the whole family attempted to move to Dundee. And I went to secondary school in Dundee, which is why I ended up at Harris. And I remember being really struck by how different Dundee was as a big sort of urban city. And the school didn't have grass anymore. I was the last cohort at the annex on Peddy Street, the top of Peddy Street in Dundee. I couldn't believe a school couldn't have a playground. So definitely the first 11 years were brilliant. I loved Harris too. I loved Dundee. It was just a very different experience from Elgin.
You know, I'm gonna cough all the time. I'm just say that now.
I'll join you for a bit of that.
I'm
I've
gonna
got a
cough.
Christmas bark as well.
I thought we should just say coughing's okay. Let's cough. And yeah, I went to university in Dundee, so I was in Dundee for 4 years. I had a really nice time there. I have a huge affection for the Dundonian people. I had a really nice time. But I really like asking my guests if they had a good experience at school or not, because some people have great experiences, but other people it's like the miserable days of their life. So I think it's very good to find out about that.
And
Um,
it shapes much of your life, doesn't it? Like I don't think you ever shake off the fact you've had a terrible time at school. It's something that lingers with you. It shows you how important it is.
that's right. It shapes your whole future, and people don't realize that, and that's so important. Um, I, and when you finish at school, you studied law at Aberdeen, uh, and then social policy at Edinburgh University. So if you hadn't been in politics, would you have been a lawyer?
Do I was one of those kids who was really studious. I was going to say geeky. I'm happy to wear the badge of geeky. There's nothing wrong with being geeky, but I like school. I worked really hard and I enjoyed it a great deal. So I got
Um,
really good grades. And when you got your chat with the guidance teacher in fifth year at school, what you're going to do with these grades, they said to me, well, there's only two things you can really do. It's either law or medicine. It was so narrow-minded, like the idea that if I was to do anything else, it would be somehow a waste of the grades that I had. I think about that quite a lot. I think what a shame that is rather than have a conversation with a kid about, and I was a kid, let's remember,
yeah.
about what they might really want to do and what they might really like. And like, so I felt my options were narrowed down quite significantly, even at school. And I knew there was no way I could be a doctor. So it was the law for me. And then I went to study law and hated it instantly.
No,
Um,
really.
Oh yeah, no, I was pretty
Oh,
miserable at uni, and it was a weird time because I did law at Aberdeen, and law was a faculty in its own right, which meant that if you didn't like your course and you wanted to change course, you could do that within your faculty, but not beyond it. So I couldn't really move from law to anything else unless I dropped out and started again a year later, and there was no way my parents were stomaching that. Also, couldn't have afforded it because that would have been 1 year of student finance that I lost. So I had to stick at it. And I did stick at it and I did graduate, but there was never any chance I was going to be a lawyer, much to my mum's annoyance. I
oh.
think she would much rather I was a rich lawyer than having gone into politics.
You must have been really studious at school because I'm sure that you're a head girl. So you must have been right what I had. So looking back, at that time, what, is there something that you wished you'd gone to study instead of medicine or law, what would you have liked somebody have said to you, you could go and do this, go and do that.
So I work generally in life not hankering onto regrets, to be honest. I
Oh,
don't see the
yeah,
point in
yeah.
having regrets. So when I look back now, I do see it as a positive that I have a law degree because it meant actually years later when I became a politician, it was quite handy to have a law degree, the ability to read legislation really quickly and to understand it and to kind of know how laws are made or how to influence them. That turned out to be pretty useful. And there's something analytical about studying law as well, which I think applies really well to politics. So I don't regret doing it. I mean, if I'd indulged myself, I probably would have done something like English literature. I was really good at English at school. I still really love reading and I love literature in general. I don't know if that would have changed my life trajectory. I don't know if I would have
No,
ended up in politics or not. Who knows? But I certainly
no,
don't regret doing law.
yeah, you best say it's best not go back with regrets. Haven't said that. I haven't said that. I've got bags of regrets.
You know what they are, though. You don't have to have
Yeah,
done things differently. You just need to
it's
know what they are.
Yeah, it sounds great to say, oh, I've no regrets, but the truth is, I've got 100 regrets.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I really regret things. So, so you finished it at Edinburgh University. You studied policy, and then, but it was 2011 that you first got elected. What happened in between Edinburgh University and being elected? And what sort of time scale was that, because I didn't want to try and
Sure. So I
work it out.
graduated from Aberdeen in 2003 and I moved to Edinburgh that same year. So in the September of 2003, me and two other girls from Aberdeen put all our belongings in a big white van and moved to Edinburgh without a flat to go to, by the way. We found a flat the first day that we arrived and I lived in Dewar Place Lane, which is right bang in the centre of the West End of Edinburgh, behind Torfickan Police Station,
Oh,
above a garage. It was the tiniest, weirdest flat, but I absolutely loved it because it was super cheap then. It was only £190 a month, which you think what people pay in
yeah,
rent
we
now,
think we paid nowadays is, uh,
extortionate, extortionate. So I moved to Edinburgh in 2003, knowing that I wanted to do something around kind of policy. I didn't really know what, but the Scottish Parliament was getting quite exciting then. It was starting to do big things, and I wanted to be in and around it. I still wasn't very political though. I wasn't a member of a political party at that point. I hadn't
mm,
been political at university in any way. But I knew something exciting was happening in Edinburgh, and that's why I went to Edinburgh. Um, and basically, of my three, we were a flat of three, Kim, Michelle, and myself. Kim was the first person to get a job. She went off and worked for Halifax Bank of Scotland and is now a hugely successful banker all around the world. Michelle and I stayed at home looking for jobs and actually spent a lot of time on the couch in the living room drinking, just be very honest about it,
Nice.
and having big chats and trying to work out what we thought about the world.
Yeah.
And she said to me, all these things that you think and you feel, these are things that the Labour Party stands for. You should think about joining the Labour Party.
Wow.
So after a wee while of these conversations, I did join the Labour Party and I got my kind of big girl pants on and went to my first meeting on my own, which was in Gorgie Memorial Hall. And I joined what was then the Edinburgh Central Labour Party. And the
Yeah.
MP for Edinburgh Central was Alistair Darling.
Oh,
So
I was talking to
yeah, so I've been
him.
thinking a lot about this recently because obviously he's just passed
Yeah,
away
it's
very
just
suddenly and very sadly. But I walked into that meeting. Alistair Darling was the MP. Ian Gray, who had been an MSP in the Scottish Parliament, was then his special advisor because Alistair was the Department of Trade and Industry Secretary at the time. Ian Gray's wife was the CLP Secretary and didn't want to be the CLP Secretary anymore. And I walked out the meeting the CLP Secretary. So I got responsibilities pretty quickly in the local Labour Party, and it just
yeah.
went on from there, David.
But that must have been quite an initiation, and going to the Labour Party and walking out the secretary or something.
I had no idea what I was doing or what I'd
Um,
signed up for.
yeah,
But I found this whole new family, this whole new community of people that shared my beliefs and my values, and I started to give all my free time to the Labour Party campaigning. So I spent a lot of time door knocking after work and all weekend. And that just became my life for much of my 20s. It would later, so in 2005, which was the first general election I was involved in as a party member, Alistair's seat changed. So the Boundary Commission scrapped Edinburgh Central and he had to stand in a new seat called Edinburgh South West, which was traditionally a Conservative seat because it took
right.
in much of the southwest of the city, Juniper Green, Balerno, all
Yeah.
the Craiglocker, quite wealthy communities. And we were a wee bit worried about Labour's chances in that seat, especially because in 2005 it was against the backdrop of the Iraq War and the Labour government was suddenly becoming less popular than it had been. So I got very involved in that election campaign, and that's when I realised, God, I love this. This is so
That's
exciting.
amazing. That's right. Yeah.
And I got more and more involved at that point, became what they call a Labour Party organiser. So I did specialist training to run key seat campaigns all over the country.
Yeah.
And then I did that again in 2010 in the 2007 Scottish Parliament election, and then the 2010 general election. So basically, David, that's a long-winded way of saying I spent a lot of time getting other people elected, and then
Yeah.
I woke up one
Yeah.
morning and
Yeah.
thought I
Well,
quite fancy a shot at this myself.
yeah. Great fun. Yeah. That's that's when I was gonna ask you, but you kind of answered that. You weren't involved with student politics. Well, were your family political at all? Was politics on your consciousness when you like growing up or anything?
Not certainly not party politics, and not anything you would immediately understand to be a discussion about politics. So what do I mean by that? Both my parents were teachers. My dad's passed away now, but my mum's still very much with us. And my dad was an English teacher in the same secondary school from the day it opened in 1979 until 3 years before he died when he retired. So nearly 40 years of service in one community. So he was really embedded in one place. He was also a football referee, David, and he used to joke that everybody in the town of Elgin knew my dad because they'd either been put in detention by him or sent off by him. So he was really well known in his one community. My mum was a wee bit different. She moved around a lot of different schools and changed jobs a lot more often. And She retired as the director of procurement for Dundee City Council, and what that really meant was she was responsible for building schools. So my
Wow.
mum would talk a lot about what was involved in building a school, and what you would consider when you'd build a school or a nursery or a community centre and all that sort of thing. And there was actually a lot of politics in that. So,
Yeah,
are you trying to build the best educational facility in the world? Are you trying to build the best nurturing space? Are you trying to build the best space to tackle poverty and inequality?
yeah.
Those three things are not always the same. So she would be making judgments all the time about what people needed and whether she was perpetuating inequality or resolving it by the responses that she took. And I find that really, really interesting and deep. And I see it now as deeply political.
Yeah, I guess there must be so many things that happen in a culture that people don't associate with politics, but actually they're very political. And it's like when when uh, when people say they're not interested in politics, but if you dig deeper and find out what they are concerned about and what they do talk about, I think you find that actually that they're very political. They just don't know they're political,
Yes.
or they don't want to be seen in that light. So that's an interesting point. Yeah. So. So you were first elected in 2011. In 2014, you were made deputy leader of Labour Party. In 2015, you became leader. And that's quite a trajectory. It's quite a,
Yeah. It's too
it's
fast.
quite a, yeah, too fast.
Too fast. Definitely too
Yeah,
fast.
really?
But I didn't really have a huge amount of control over that. I say that out loud, and I know how ridiculous that sounds because it's like I made an active choice, right?
Yeah.
To stand to be a politician and then to stand to be deputy leader. But I guess the thing that you've maybe missed out in that timeline, and probably deliberately, knowing you, David, is this one wee matter of something called the independence referendum.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah,
So
I was, that's on the list.
it's on the list. It's on the list. So yeah, in 2011, the start was pretty fast because, like I said to you earlier, um, well, I'd worked in the Parliament for 4 years by that point because I worked for George Fawkes for a wee while. So I knew how the Parliament worked. I also had this law degree, so I kind of knew my way around the system a wee bit. So when I got elected, I had a pretty good head start. I knew how things worked. So I was promoted quite quickly. I was in Joanne Lamont's shadow cabinet
Right,
within
yeah.
the first 6 months as Labour's youth employment spokesperson. And back in 2011-12, we actually had a massive youth unemployment crisis in Scotland. Nearly 1 in 5 young people couldn't get a job. We
Mm.
forget that now, but it was really tough. So they made a special role, and that was the role that I got. And then I think I was in that for um, maybe a year or so, or just under a year before they made me or gave me my dream job, which was Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Education. That's
Was
a
that
favourite job.
was that your dream job?
That was my dream job, definitely.
Yeah.
And I really loved that. And I guess that's when I started to get a bit more of a public profile and started to run campaigns or be in the news or the media a lot. And I was in that role during the referendum. Um, and that's the first time I did question time, and that's the first time I got asked to do big TV debates. And that's when everything sort of went boom.
Yeah.
So profile wise anyway, so in the aftermath of the independence referendum, which the no campaign won, but Labour lost in a lot of ways because
Yeah.
a lot of people were very angry at the Labour Party in the aftermath of that. Or if they didn't regret the choice they'd made in the referendum, they certainly wanted Scotland to be stronger than it was or to have a louder voice than it did. And the way they articulated that was voting for the SNP. So there was a big shift in the aftermath of the 2014 independence referendum towards the SNP. And all of that sort of in the late autumn of 2014 and early 2015 in the lead up to the general election in 2015 meant that Joanne Lamont quit as Labour leader in
Yeah.
Scotland, and there was a vacancy both for her job as leader and for a deputy post. So Jim Murphy became leader, I became his deputy. He lasted, I don't know, maybe 6 months max. And the cause of his downfall was in 2015 when the Labour Party went from having 41 seats in Scotland to one seat in Scotland, with Ian Murray being the only MP left. that meant that Jim Murphy himself lost his seat. And it was this weird moment where I was kind of like the last person standing, and there was an expectation on me at that point to step up
Yeah,
and be leader. And I was 33, David. That's super young.
that's how young it's been a leader in Scotland. And yeah, when you're talking there, I had kind of forgotten about the kind of the sort of decimation of the Labour Party at that time. I look at it now, but I kind of forget that it was after 2014 and the consequences of that really led to it. Um, but I was gonna come on, because you know, but because Labour in Scotland seems a million miles from the days of uh, Donald Dewar and John Smith. And it's just, is it that time, is it that aftermath of the referendum that's caused the decimation?
A big question. So I guess there's an academic answer to that, and then there's my answer to that, and there'll be an overlap, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So if you look at the history of voting intention since devolution, from the high mark of 1999, support for Labour has dropped consistently over the past 25 years. Now, for the first, 10 years or just under of that, you could understand that because Labour were a party of government, and parties of government generally lose support the more they're in government, right? You see that happening now to the SNP, you see that happening to the Conservatives. And that takes you to the sort of 2007 Scottish Parliament election, which, if you remember, Labour only lost incredibly narrowly. They lost by one seat, and there was one seat where the majority was 1,400 votes, North Ayrshire and Arran. So, if you wanted to be really pejorative about it, you could say it came down to,
Yeah,
not much more than a handful or a ballot box of votes in that whole election. And that changed the trajectory of Scottish politics for the next decade or so, because it led to Alex Salmond as First Minister. And that gave Scotland, for the first time, a really loud nationalist voice. And power behind the nationalist voice. And the SNP operated as a minority administration with the support of the Conservatives. People forget that, but the Conservatives voted for every one of the SNP's budgets from 2007 to 2011, and it allowed the SNP to demonstrate that they could govern, that they could handle power, so to speak. So when the electorate in 2011 voted, they gave the SNP a majority for the first time, and basically broke the Scottish Parliament system, because it was never supposed to deliver that. PR was never supposed to put so much power in one party's hands, but the SNP did so well in that election, they basically broke the model. And because they had a majority, that gave them the mandate to have an independence referendum. David Cameron signs the Edinburgh Agreement and gives the Scottish Parliament the power to hold that referendum. And suddenly everything in Scotland between 2011 and 2014 is a conversation about independence and the
yeah,
independence referendum. So that was my experience of my first 3 years in Parliament. I was elected in 2011, was, everything we talked about was seen through the prism of the Constitution. I find that really frustrating.
yeah.
That doesn't mean I don't want to have a conversation about the Constitution. I definitely do. But wheelie bins, do they really need to be seen through the prism of yes and no? Like
Yeah.
road repairs? Like, there is a link, of course there is, and that link is about money and where money comes from and whether it's fairly distributed. But it got pretty dull, to be honest, for everything to
Yeah.
be seen
Oh,
through
yeah,
yes
yeah.
and no.
And I'm not sure if you'd agree that, every debate, I would say that, and, and every debate even now today is through the prism of independence. And what has been the case from from 2014 onwards. I feel that everything in Scottish politics is is against the background of the constitutional question, and it's going to be that way. It feels like forever, or until we have another referendum, or until and even if we had another referendum, and whichever way it goes, they have they have split Scotland down the middle, and that's going to take decades, absolute decades to change and to heal and I don't know if you would agree with that.
I do. I agree with a lot of that. I do think it's changing a little bit, David, and I'm really glad that it is because when you ask people now what the most important issue to them is in Scotland, the Constitution isn't anymore the number one issue. It's the economy and the cost of living and how financially secure people feel. Now,
Yeah.
that obviously has a link to the Constitution as well, but it's no longer people's number one priority. And I think it could change fundamentally at the next general election. So, if Labour win the next general election, I actually think you'll see support for independence fall a little bit. And that could be quite significant because support for independence is always around 45% or higher. I think if it dips below 40 or even down to 35, it does become a bit of a question of the past, a bit of a secondary question again.
Yeah.
So there is potential that you're right, everything being seen through this prism for the last 10 years, there's potential that the next 10 years needn't be like that. They could be quite different. Um, it's not inevitable though. I worry a little bit about Labour winning the next general election and then not doing enough around, I like to call it, I guess, the wiring of Britain. So like the way that the country's structured, where power sits, how it's shared, what's devolved and whether it works properly. I would like to see the next government do an awful lot more of that rewiring work. That includes electoral reform. It also includes having an alternative to the House of Lords. There's a whole heap of different issues that I would like to look at in terms of rewiring the country for the future. And I worry a bit that if Labour don't do enough of that, they'll just reaffirm that frame that you described, where everything's just seen through this set of binary choices between
Mhm.
independence or the status quo.
Yeah, they've got a lot of work to do. And I think if Labour get elected, which of course I hope they do, uh, I think that they should do a lot on the, like I say, the rewiring. That's a good word, because after 2014, we were promised a lot more diversion, and it did not happen. And the that's to the detriment of Scotland, and it's also to the detriment of the UK because it means that the constitutional question has remained to the fore. And so I sincerely hope that the Labour Party get elected. But sometimes I have to be honest, I feel like people are talking like it's a done deal, and the Tories are gonna lose, Kier Starmer's gonna get in, and I hate to be a pessimist, but I think he's got so much to do between now and then, people are not in love with Kier Starmer, you know, and and I don't know what is how he'll overcome that. And he said himself that his uh, his path to Downing Street it goes via Scotland, and he's got a lot to do up here. If he's to get elected, I wonder if he thought he's going to do it or not.
So there's a lot in that.
Yeah,
First of all, just picking up on your last point about there not being enough devolution after the independence referendum in 2014, I kind of half agree with you there. So in truth, a lot of additional powers around taxes did come to the Scottish Parliament after that. So it is true to say that half the money we spend in Scotland now is raised in Scotland. Now, that is very different from before the independence referendum. Actually, I don't think it's been particularly helpful because of the way the fiscal framework works. It's
no,
actually much harder now to raise money and keep money in Scotland unless our economy outstrips the level of income revenue in England and Wales. It's a really complicated formula, but there is a little bit of a straitjacket around how those tax systems work in practice, even though we've now got 50% of our tax powers in Scotland. The things I wished that had been devolved that didn't happen, that would have made a big difference.
yeah,
Employment law. and immigration. So some of the big fundamental challenges we face as a country in Scotland could be addressed by having different employment and immigration policies in Scotland. And I find that really regrettable. I think that's something we should definitely fix in the short term. Look, on the question of Kier Starmer, I happen to know him. I really like him. He's a brilliant public servant. He's a very serious man. Those are qualities we should want in our next Prime Minister, given the traits we've had of the last few recent ones.
Yeah.
But I do understand the critique that he's not set in the heather alight. Might I suggest that's deliberate? And he's always hinted at having a kind of three-part strategy ahead of the next general election. The first thing he wanted to do was to show the country that the Labour Party had changed immeasurably from the days of Jeremy Corbyn, that it could be trusted with power, that it could be trusted with the management of the economy, that it was full of sensible people who were interested in serving the country from ministerial office and being a party of government rather than a party just of protest, even though the ability to protest is really important and a fundamental part of a functioning democracy. And then he also said the second thing he wanted to do was to lay the blame and prove beyond doubt that the state of the country in its current form was the fault of the Conservatives. And
Yeah.
actually, he didn't have to do a whole heap of that work. Liz Truss did it for him when she blew up the economy last year. I mean, that was the single biggest gift anyone gave the Labour Party in the past couple of years was Liz Truss's tenure as Prime Minister and what that did to people's mortgage rates and their sense of security. The third part now is the one that he's starting with his New Year's speech and is actually really, really important. And that's proving that people's lives can be better with a Labour government. And
Yeah.
he's called it Project Hope. And I hope that it works because actually for me that is a big missing bit of the jigsaw is being able to demonstrate how a Labour government is going to be better than the current government in really practical, meaningful like terms that you can touch. And the reason I say that is because we've heard a lot from Rachel Reeves about conservatism when it comes to the public finances. She says we're not going to turn on the taps, there's not going to be a massive increased investment in welfare spending, things will be difficult for the first couple of years. All of that is sound and necessary and important, but it doesn't bring you a huge sense of hope, right? There's an awful lot of people that
No.
need help now. So I think we'll hear a lot more in the next couple of months from Keir Starmer about things that will definitely be different and better as a consequence of his government. And if he does that, I think he'll win and he'll win well. If he doesn't do that, he's really gambling. He's really gambling on people going to the ballot box and just voting the Conservatives out rather than Labour in.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think he is taking a bit of a gamble right now because I feel like that the as you say, they're not making promises to spend more on welfare. And you know, one of the things I think he said back in the autumn that one of the things that he won't do is change the cap on onto children and benefit. And sometimes I think that's fair enough, but I worry that'll backfire on him because it's the as you say that the Labour Party are trying to look like they are good at managing the economy, everything's safe for them, welfare spending, but I'm worried that they're doing too much to compensate for that, and it could backfire.
Totally. And only time will tell whether that's going to change. But it's very clear to me that the third part of his three-part strategy has started at the turn of this year. So hopefully we will see more of that. And just to say 100% agree with you on the two-child cap. So I like to really follow the work of the Resolution Foundation, which is the biggest think tank in the UK that looks at living standards and reports on the economy as it affects working people. And they demonstrated in their Inquiry 2030 report just before Christmas that one of the most significant things you could do to close inequality in Britain and to tackle child poverty is to scrap the two-child cap. Like it would fundamentally address poverty very quickly in a very measured, considered way. And I really hope Labour change their position on that.
Yeah, yeah. I hope they change it too because that's when I say I am worried about advising him, and I'm worried that he's trying to work as right wing as he possibly can, uh, and uh, and they won't get left. But I suppose the only time will tell. So I'm just gonna look at the time. So uh, so you've been at the John Smith Institute how long now? A few years?
Be 5 years in July, believe it or not.
Man, well, and it tells about your work there.
So the John Smith Centre exists really to do three things: to research the relationship between the people and their public, so the degree to which we trust our politicians and trust the public institutions that are in our lives. And the truth is, we don't really. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, a degree of healthy skepticism is important in a democracy. You wouldn't want to live in a country where everybody trusts their government implicitly, right? That would be a
Oh,
dictatorship. But we should be concerned about just how poor our levels of trust in politicians and public institutions has become. It's its lowest ever recorded levels. And it's also increasingly unequal. So young people, people on low incomes, and women in particular, are distrustful of their politicians and their political institutions. So if you compound that and you think, if you're a young, poor female, you're about as far removed from people with power and influence as you possibly can be. But from my political perspective, you're probably most in need of having contact and trust and belief in them for the benefit or betterment of your own life. So I find that really interesting. We also advocate for politics as a force for good. So we run lots of events trying to make the positive case for politics, the positive case for public service, highlighting when our politicians do great things, really interesting things, really important work, because somebody's got to do that, right? We can't always be negative about our politicians all of the time. And then finally, one of the favourite bits of my job is the internship and development programmes that we run. So we have a variety of different programmes which are designed to break down the structural barriers that certain underrepresented groups face accessing public life. So this is mostly focused around young people, although not exclusively. And we provide paid structured internships for young people, either in politics or in what I call like the civic bubble around our political life. So
mm-hmm.
with big charities or non-governmental organisations or people that are working in and around campaigning and policy making across Scotland. They also tend to be really white, really middle class organisations. So we've got one scheme, for example, which is only for minority ethnic young people, trying to give them better pathways and routes into policy making and campaigning jobs, in the hope that more diverse representation in those roles will lead to more diverse policies and campaigning as a consequence.
That's something fascinating. What you say, some people feel the politics is so far removed from their life and so far, removed, but they're the ones who need it most. And and
100%.
and, and of course, one of the most underrepresented groups is disabled people, and I wonder if that's something that the institute focused on.
Yes, so we are very careful when we go through our selection processes to make sure that the young people that come through our programmes are as representative as they possibly can be. We have, as a minimum, really 20% of our programme participants are people with a declared disability. Now, you know the law around this much better than I ever will, David, but people aren't required and sometimes choose not to disclose a disability to us at the point of application. Sometimes it's something they'll only tell us about afterwards. We don't at the moment have any programmes which are specifically and exclusively for disabled people, but we have had conversations with a couple of different disability charities in Scotland about looking at something bespoke like that. You'll remember the 1 in 5 campaign, which was something that was set up specifically to address the underrepresentation of disabled people in public life that the Scottish Parliament really took on. And we were careful not to try and duplicate that or get in the way of that, because I think that's really important to have the Scottish Parliament's central endorsement of that. But if you've got time, I'll maybe just give you one quick story about what we've tried to do to challenge systemic inequality when it comes to disabled people.
Yeah, of course,
I'll be
please.
super quick. So
No, no,
So one of our programs is called the Parliamentary Internship Programme, and it's about placing young people with an MSP for up to 10 weeks in a paid
Wow.
structured internship programme. It's our longest standing programme and it's really successful. We've actually got young people starting this week in the Scottish Parliament on it. It's just brilliant. But and we've had quite a few young disabled students on that programme, and we always do a really serious and thorough evaluation of their experiences afterwards. And it became apparent that lots of MSP's constituency offices weren't accessible. And I find that really interesting. So you'd think, how can that
Yeah.
be that an MSP's office isn't accessible? Well,
Yeah.
in truth, David, they were accessible to the public. So they had to be, for example, flat street level access. And if a disabled constituent was trying to go and see their MSP, everything about that experience would be accessible to the member of the public. But where it fell down was when it came to how accessible their offices were for staff. And actually, that was a big black mark against the Scottish Parliament
Wow,
because
that's interesting.
real absence of disabled toilets. If there were disabled toilets, they were being used as storerooms. Kitchen facilities weren't accessible. They wouldn't, for example, be adjustable desks or necessarily all the necessary screen adaptations that people might expect. So we thought that was pretty shocking, actually, particularly for a parliament that seems to care so much about diversity and inclusivity and accessibility. So we wrote to the Scottish Parliament as an organisation and said, look, you should really investigate and do a proper inquiry into how accessible parliamentary offices are to disabled staff or prospective disabled staff. And they said no. They said that they were,
Wow,
I
gosh.
know, I
Yeah.
know. So we were really disappointed with that. And I just share that story with you to say, we think about this stuff a lot, and we think about, one, how can we, give more disabled young people experiences in politics, but also, given the power and agency we have as the John Smith Centre, what can we do? Are we doing enough to challenge systemic inequality, like
Yeah.
how negative that experience is for somebody who actually gets there and then finds that they can't have a fully inclusive experience because of the structural inequalities that exist. So we do try to take this really seriously and work on it week in, week out. I'm not saying we're perfect. I'm not saying we've got all the answers, but we are very much committed to it.
No, that sounds fantastic, and sounds like you're doing a lot of great work, and it's quite shocking when you look at MSPs not being accessible to everybody. But that's really terrific that the what you're doing, and I'm really interested in what you do around or what you said about trust in politics, because if you look at the last uh, you know uh, 10 years of Conservative government and SNP government, it's really not difficult to see why people don't trust pod. There's a lot of real awful skullduggery goes on, particularly down the road at Westminster, and and I don't know where it started to root out some of that, It's just such an endemic. Yeah, it's like it's just so. But I was reading a fantastic book at the moment, and the author is using the analogy of the Russian doll. When you take off the top, you get another one. And you
Yes.
take off and I think it's true. It's a it's a great book, but absolutely.
So you're totally right, and maybe I could just share a couple of the academic answers to your question. So, one thing we know is that when a scandal hits a political party, it actually affects all politicians. So I think one of the mistakes that was made early on during COVID and everything to do with Partygate and Downing Street was the sense in some political parties, oh, this is great, this is going to lead to the downfall of the Conservatives, when actually the way that the public saw that scandal was a plague on all their houses. They didn't see Conservative politicians, they just saw politicians. So
Yeah.
actually that affected political parties across the board, and I think that needs to be better understood. The other thing I would maybe just suggest to you, David, is that we know how to fix this. So there's lots of evidence about how you build trust. We think about trust a lot in our own lives, right? Every relationship we have with another human being is built on trust. And when that trust is broken, sometimes it's irreparable, sometimes there is a route back, but it's all relational, and it's all about kind of consequences and actions. So the first thing the public look for when they're looking to trust people with power and influence in their lives, whether it be politicians or institutions, is that actions have consequences. So when something goes wrong, somebody should be punished. Rules should be applied, rules should be easily understood, and rules should be followed. So, when there is a big political scandal, when somebody stands up, apologizes, and resigns, actually that builds trust. It doesn't destroy it. When that doesn't happen, that breaks down trust. And we saw an awful lot of that, I think, in recent times, where people haven't taken responsibility for their actions, haven't apologized, tried to get away with it. It's that type of behavior that really deteriorates trust.
Mm. Yeah, and unfortunately, we've seen quite a lot of it in recent times, which is not been good. But I'm sure, or certainly hope, when the Labour Party get elected later this year, I hope that it restores a lot more trust in public service.
I hope you're right, but I don't think it will. I think this is going to take decades.
Take
Um,
on
exactly because of that point I just shared with you, which is the public don't differentiate between different colours of politicians when they're asked whether they trust them or not.
yeah.
So it'll take a long time to build back up. I think there are lots of things you can do to build trust. Some of them are things like changing the voting system, like which you might not think automatically is linked, but it is linked because it's about how easily we can get rid of politicians that we don't like or want or trust anymore.
Yeah, that'd be nice to be able to get rid of politicians a lot more easily. That would help if we could eject them more easily. But anyway, Kate, I could talk to you all day, and I'm very conscious of time, But it's been really great to talk to you this morning. I thoroughly enjoyed our discussion.
Likewise, David, and it's been brilliant to see you. It's been too long.
Yeah, and it has been too long, and it's great to get up with you again. And just to say again, thank you so much for doing this and for giving me your time with this. I'm very grateful.
Not at all. All the best. I wish you well.
Thank you.